Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the RFA webinar on changing political and economic risks for the road freight industry. It's great to have you with us on this Wednesday afternoon. My name is Gavin Kelly. I work at the Road Freight Association here in Isando in Johannesburg, Gauteng, and I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer for the association. I'd like to thank all our attendees for your support and for attending. You can post your comments and questions during the speakers' presentations, actually live on screen. If you look to your bottom right, you'll see there's an area there where you can type your questions, and the questions will be answered after each of the presentations. If we don't get to all the questions, we then post them on the website, on the RFA website, that's www.rfa.co.za, where we post all questions, even those answered and those unanswered, with the answers to the questions. You will recall that there is a lucky draw, so please make sure you stay with us for the duration of the webinar, and we will do the lucky draw at the end of the webinar, where you stand a chance to win free registration to the RFA Convention 2021, as well as 2 nights accommodation, and that's down at Zimbali in KZN. So good luck, and I hope it's you that wins that prize. Right, let's kick off with Kevin Bart. Kevin Bart is employed currently with SAPIA, the South African Petroleum Industries Association. Hopefully I got that right, Kevin. And there's been much written in the media, both the normal print media and social media, over the last couple of weeks about fuel supply. We've heard about fuel shortages, and then there have been fuel retailers who've been threatening shutdowns. So this afternoon, we are going to have a good chat around what is the current state of fuel supply and what can road freight operators expect going forward. Do we need to be concerned? What exactly is it that we need to know? So to give us all the facts and the behind the scenes information, here's Kevin Bart to give us an update on that. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I trust everybody can hear me, and good afternoon to you all. This is just a quick liquid fuel supply update, just to tell you where we stand at this stage in time. Hopefully I can get this thing to move. Right, there we go. Right, if we go back to the lockdown of the 26th of March 2020, there was an immediate impact on fuel demand, obviously, with demand destruction, what we're calling it, across all liquid fuels. That not only happened here in South Africa, but actually happened internationally. The worst felt locally was jet fuel, which dropped to something like 10% of normal demand. Now, if you consider that jet fuel annual demand is about 1.5 billion liters, that dropped to roughly about 150,000 liters. My arithmetic is not great, so I'll leave it at that. 0.15 billion liters on an annualized basis. Petrol dropped to about 30% of normal demand, diesel 40% of normal. The reason why diesel actually stayed significantly higher than petrol was mainly because of the mines, and also because of you truckers carting around essential services and goods. Consequence was felt across the economy was a rise in inventories of fuels, and that's all fuels. And the initial refining response was to curtail production and then eventually halt operations. Now, at that stage in time, at the beginning of March, Astron Energy, the refinery at Milnerton in Cape Town, was already down for a scheduled maintenance turnaround. But on the 26th of March, NREF halted production on the 27th of March. SAPREF shut down late in April, and NATREF also shut down in April. Secunda curtailed production in order to cater with the rapid rise in inventories, and Mossel Bay trundled on as per usual. So that by the beginning of May, all refineries have been shut down except for Secunda, as I said, scaled back. With respect to retail sites, some in fact closed, temporarily, but many had curtailed operating hours. From May, the lockdown started easing from the beginning of May, and the refineries contemplated restarts. But a restart is not something which you do just because, so to speak, because they're not quick. They require safe making beforehand, unit readiness, heat up of production units, and the slow introduction of feed. So by the time you actually decide in order to actually restart a refinery, which will normally come from the marketers, it probably takes about 1 to 2 weeks to actually completely what is called line out the refinery, which means start up and ensure that the rundown streams are on specification so your blending can be correct. So by mid-June, SAPREF and NREF had lined out and were online. Astron Energy was still undergoing maintenance, but the targeted restart in July. MATREF restarted only late in June, actually in mid-June, mainly due to high jet fuel stocks. Jet fuel demand has still not recovered anywhere near towards pre-lockdown levels. So at the beginning of July, we had an unfortunate incident at Astron Energy at the refinery in Milnerton. Means that that refinery operations have been delayed. When it will come back at this stage in time, we do not know. At Natref and Secunda, there were some temporary unit incidents, but those now have been largely overcome, and production has been restored at those refineries. That's full production. So the supply situation from May, the easing of the lockdown saw a rebound in demand for main fuels, predominantly petrol and diesel. But the market kept wet mainly from stock and tank, but also from imports. And imports were scheduled by the various oil companies coming both into Durban and into Cape Town. However, the situation inland was markedly different. We've had multiple incidents of line tampering, which meant that stock from the coast could not replenish depots inland. And you would have noticed in the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy budget speech, he does mention that in the speech that tampering of the line has led to incidents of stockouts and rationing, especially of diesel in the inland region. So we've had reported shortages of diesel in the Free State and parts of Mpumalanga, principally affecting the agricultural sector. And the agricultural sector was undergoing at this stage in time reaping of their harvest in order to then supply the mills and in turn to supply the various retailers. But we now have action by the police in curtailing the line tampering, and inland stock is now recovering. However, these incidents are still occurring, but a lot more attention is being paid by the police to what is happening here. In Cape Town, the refinery incidents means that we'll have imports there for the foreseeable future. When this was written, imports couldn't land due to poor weather, and there were reported diesel stockouts in Cape Town, but that should now be largely overcome. Going forward, expected supply situation to year end. Since the lockdown, the industry really has been in a recovery mode. And what we mean by recovery mode is restoring stock, restoring refinery operations, and getting things back to normal, if one could say things are normal in this type of pandemic. So we see stocks are recovering inland, but expect a tight situation of the prior weeks to significantly ease. But this is crucially dependent on pipeline performance. And just to give you an idea, the inland production of main fuels, petrol and diesel, is roughly about 25 million litres per day. But the demand for these fuels is roughly about 39 million litres per day. So most of that demand is, in fact, comes up from the pipeline. It comes up by pipeline. Some of it also comes through Komatipoort from Matola in Mozambique. But nevertheless, Cape Town area should recover as the weather eases, and stock replenish from imports. There was a recent electrical interruption at Mossel Bay, but that is overcome, and some other incidents has in fact interrupted, so to speak, the refinery restart there. Post-pandemic, the post-COVID situation may see a very different supply and demand scenario. Previously, South Africa was in fact production deficit, relying on diesel imports in particular to keep the market wet. We're importing roughly 20 to 30% of our diesel requirements. Post-COVID, we expect, unfortunately, to see a drop in diesel and in petrol demand. But what we could see is that the structural supply-demand imbalance now be rebalanced so that everything we make, we should be able to put back into the market without importing much more product. As we saw back in April and May, fuel prices, which initially collapsed, are now recovering. The large crude overhang is now being worked down, which has been helped by the production cuts from OPEC. The crude overhang is that a lot of these crude-producing countries were still producing crude. That was in fact being stored on very large crude carriers out at sea. But all that now is, in fact, that is starting to be worked down, which means that overhang is worked down so the supply situation is normalizing on crude. But the opening of the jet market is in fact crucial for wider recovery, and that's not only in South Africa, but that is internationally as well. We know that all local oil companies have been significantly affected by the pandemic. Some international oil majors have already announced significant cutbacks in capital expenditure and curtailing or undergoing retrenchments and restructuring plans. However, we're still awaiting actions by our local companies. And that is all I have to say.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I think it was short and sweet. We received one question that came in via SMS. I think perhaps there's a connectivity problem. And that was, how vulnerable is the pipeline? There were reports of multiple breaches in 1 month. And what should the DME be doing to secure this in future? I don't know if you can answer that question, but that was a question put to us.
Sorry, my audio and video was switched off. I cannot answer that in full. There's confidentiality associated with that. Nevertheless, this has been escalated up to the top of Transnet, obviously. Transnet Pipelines is giving this a lot of attention, along with the police. Some arrests have in fact been made. There was an incident which was widely reported in the newspaper that 2 of these thieves were actually caught around Rustenburg area. They ended up in court, and then 2 other people purporting to be lawyers came to try gain their release, but they were also arrested. So this is getting attention by the police in order to actually prevent this happening, because a pipeline is seen as critical infrastructure for, in the country. It is not a national key point, interestingly, although the depots feeding the pipeline are national key points. A point is a single point. The pipeline's a long length string, so to speak. So that's why. But nevertheless, it is seen as critical infrastructure. The police are looking at it in detail as to how these incidents can be stopped.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I don't think there's much. Obviously, the operations and the details one wouldn't want to speak about. But the important thing is that it has been identified and that there will be something done in terms of it. And we just hope that whatever those mitigating circumstances are, we don't have the same sort of thing happening again. And it always happens at the critical point when stocks are low or supply is endangered, or whatever the case may be. But thank you very much.
Just a point on that as well. These thieves have obviously been tampering with the pipeline. They're taking product and they're selling it on, for want of a better word, the black market, so to speak. maybe through licensed wholesalers, maybe not. But remember, and obviously I'm going to punt the oil companies in this respect, that always be very wary of fuels you buy, especially those fuels which are significantly cheaper than other people are doing it, selling it, because of this type of tampering. We don't have full control as a consequence thereof of these fuels, so to speak, of the supply chain with respect to that. So there could well be other things in these fuels which may cause trucks to stop. So it's not advisable to actually go that route.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is the quality of what you're getting. You don't know whether that's been thinned out and other wonderful additives added to it, like water. I mean, water's good at doubling your volume of diesel, evidently, but isn't good for your engine. But once again,
but illuminating paraffin.
yes, but water is the cheap additive.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We appreciate that, and if we get any more questions, we'll get them through to you. Well, that takes us on to the next presenter, Ongama Mtimka. He's a familiar face. He's done 1 or 2 presentations for us at a conference, and he's a familiar voice. You will have seen him on TV and heard him on radio. I'm not sure whether he does the lotto draws. Ongama, do you do that as well? No? Not part of your financial repertoire. He's a sought-after expert who offers cutting-edge political commentary in South Africa with a specialist focus on the link between politics and the economy. I still, to this day, refer to that presentation of yours in Swaziland, and people actually, I think, for the first 15 minutes sat there with mouths dropped down to their knees. They couldn't believe, in terms of the straight way in which you presented that and the factual way in which you presented it. I certainly learned a lot. So definitely, I respect you, and you're widely respected both locally and internationally. Let's hear what you have to say about the trucking industry and what political and economic risks we can expect going forward. The floor is yours, Ongama.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Gavin. I'm really grateful to the Road Freight Association for inviting me here. And it's really a great opportunity whenever we as academics can have our work influence how industry thinks and feels about trends which may affect their business. So it's an important part of what we do to ensure that we prepare industries and make sure that they capitalize on some of the trends, minimize the risks, and maximize on the opportunities that come. So today I wanted to talk about changing political economic risks for the road freight industry in SA. And I'm grateful that Kevin, in his presentation, spoke directly to what COVID-19 meant for a very crucial input into your business as the trucking, as the road freight industry, fuel, and how, as I was listening to him, most of the responses, in fact, had been triggered, not just by the outbreak itself, but how politically that outbreak was managed. You know, there's a saying that 5% of what happens to us affects us, but 95% is contributed by our response to it. And I think that the political situation and economic situation that's come as a result of COVID-19 crystallizes that. So today, what I want to touch on in broad terms is the direct COVID-19 implications on national politics, changes in the party system, and the last section is really a thought, what I hope will be a thought-provoking session, discussing the extent to which we could find new ways of doing things in ways that can help us unlock growth in the economy. So the first I want to talk about is the political and economic implications from COVID-19. So what we saw, and I discussed this under an important question like, in which circumstances does democracy not work and dictatorship or quasi-authoritarian style of governance appears to be the more appealing style for people compared to democracy, which we have fought hard for in order to have as peoples around the world. So what we saw at the outbreak of the disaster was calls for and a response in executive dominance. So the Constitution gives executive powers for governing South Africa on the president, and it says that executive power is vested in the president, and then he delegates that power to his ministers. So what we saw at the beginning is government doing something, and in fact it was not just ours, something which is unthinkable in a democracy, telling us that there's going to be a 21-day declaration of a state of national disaster, and in terms of that, there are certain freedoms which we've come to appreciate, which were not going to be available to us anymore. And in fact, to prove how government was serious, they deployed armies and police all around the streets throughout South Africa, making sure that we complied with what they spelled out as the law. That was quite interesting. What was interesting for me is that there was a general sense of consensus nationally that that was the preferred style, especially as far as closing gatherings are concerned. The religious sector, which very much gets to be quickly up in arms and defends its rights, was very much supportive of the national lockdown. And in fact, most among them, especially among the big churches, saying, look, it is wise for us not to heed to what government is prescribing and ensure that there aren't gatherings or exceeding that initial 50 people. And then obviously a state of national disaster was declared later in March. And a very interesting choice there, which I will talk about, the choice between a state of emergency and a state of national disaster, which was discussed in the courts, by the way. So the national lockdown was announced as a result of the declaration of the national disaster. And we went to level 5 of lockdown, which is banning of, alcohol the sales, as well as tobacco sales, imposing of restrictions on freedom of movement, among other things. Now, as we started week 2 of that national lockdown, South Africans started resorting to their ways of debating and challenging state policy, because I think at the time the economy was beginning to feel pressure. And my argument in an article which I had written, which is titled "Support for Lockdown," it can be Googled online. I argued that the consensus which we saw at the beginning and the apparent preference by South Africans of an authoritarian style of leadership was only to the extent that we agreed about, one, the common risks that we faced, and secondly, the legitimacy of the state action. And as that consensus began to crumble, we saw a lot of challenges, both in courts, in social media, and through direct engagement with the politicians, by initially the tobacco and the alcohol sector, but a lot more economic sectors started engaging government around these policies. I do say that what we witnessed not only in South Africa, but around the world in terms of the style of leadership during the 21st century was the rise of a paternalistic dictatorship. One of the things that we frown upon in political science and what we call paternalism is the policing of citizens on in certain choices which they make. A principle of freedom and liberty is that as long as one didn't harm others, they had freedom, and the state had no right to intervene as though a father would in their lives and in their choices. So we call it a right to freedom, even to the extent of inflicting self-harm. But the harm principle suggests that when an individual's choice transcends to harm for others, then state action is justified. So paternalistic dictatorship then is one in which the state intervenes pursuant to the protection of others from harm by others who are exercising their rights. So, for example, one paternalistic law is that you cannot smoke in public places, because not only do you harm your own lungs in public spaces, but you also harm others. Obviously, during lockdown, that was extended to mean you cannot smoke at all to affect your own state, your own lungs and your state of health. Why? Because you're doing so may put pressure on the health system. So that's the rise of a paternalistic dictatorship. Now, what we've moved from that, and obviously some sectors got victory and the economy got opened, and we are now, government introduced a risk-adjusted strategy, because part of what the consensus, what informed the initial consensus for the state was the idea that perhaps the gains that came from lockdown were greater than the benefits, something which I address in the article. But that was never going to remain so permanently. The more days and weeks passed, the more that equilibrium was upset. In fact, we got to a stage where it could no longer be assumed that lockdown translated to total benefit for society. So livelihoods were considered, and also we looked into debates like, for example, does the total benefit of lockdown outweigh its total costs? And in fact, the answer is yes. If you look at how government has now insisted on retaining lower levels of lockdown, notwithstanding the pressure that has come from some circles that says, let's go back to level 5. Obviously, as we have begun to open schools and other economic sectors, an important question which relates to the national disaster versus state of emergency is the question of, okay, if schools are safe enough to reopen, why don't we look at ways in which you can get parliament to open? Because that's where the executive is going to be held accountable. I believe that in choosing the more ambiguous declaration of a national disaster, the South African executive chose what was an easier path for them, but one that would allow executive dominance to continue. So the state declaring a state of emergency, for example, is highly prescribed in the State of Emergency Act in terms of how long you can declare it and what role does Parliament have to play, and questions about the extent to which rights can be infringed are spelled out, and Parliament is given the option to actually reject some of the rights that the state may encroach on as a result of wanting to manage a disaster. So my submission here is that in choosing the more ambiguous in a declaration of a national disaster rather than a state of emergency, government opted for the way that gave them somewhat a blank check. But obviously, what I appreciated about particularly the style of President Cyril Ramaphosa is he then, outside of the realm of legislation and due process as per the Act, he started engaging the stakeholders. So you can imagine this is something that lends itself as among his strengths. Imagine if you had a president whom I shall not name, but who were more prone towards undemocratic ways. It would even be a more challenging situation. The challenges have not been any less because rules around procurement, for example, had to be waived for expediency's sake. But what we have seen now with the reports that come, there's been a lot of corruption that has happened. Obviously, Parliament was in limbo initially when the lockdown came in. It was only much later that parliamentary committees found their voices. The opposition was initially docile, but we saw later on that it started picking up. I don't know if I still have, if I have, my allocation is 30 minutes. I've got 15, which I've gone through. Okay, thank you, Governor. So you're nodding there. So I want to now talk about implications beyond the lockdown, beyond the the government level. What we have seen, the members would remember that last year I highlighted a potential tension between the escalation of tension in the ANC, which might see the president under check. So today, my submission is that we've seen a grand escape by the president from COVID-19, because what it meant is that gatherings could not be held, which meant that the process leading up to the selection of delegates leading to the National General Council of the ANC was stifled, and the National General Council itself. At the time that it happened, we were already hearing rumblings that there were reconfigurations of alliances within the top six of the ANC, with some planning to challenge the president. Obviously, that was not going to see the light of day, at least in the immediate term. So we've seen President Cyril Ramaphosa having a grand escape, but I do feel that the self-destruction momentum within the ANC remains, and it's at a level where nothing can stop it. Succession politics, contrary to how the situation was after Zuma came into power in Polokwane, the underlying divides which were there did not get dealt with at conference. And in fact, what we have now seen is, instead of demobilization of the opposing factions, they have regrouped in various levels of leadership within the country and remain a thorn in the flesh for President Cyril Ramaphosa. And so there will be at some stage a reopening of politicking or political parties, just like the Democratic Alliance has in its conference, in its upcoming conference, may find new ways in which they want to continue their party political processes. My argument is that the underlying tensions which were there may have been quelled by the COVID-19 and its practical implications in terms of who can gather, but we would be very fooled if we assumed that they were gone completely. And the answer to my own question at the end about whether or not we should write the obituary of the ANC, I would say with no fear of contradiction that, in fact, based on the variables of entrenched divisions and failure to rise above factional interests, for me, the ANC is already dead. It's a matter of when it gets to actually fall, because it can never salvage itself. What we're going to see as a matter of, what affirms this thinking is that 2024, I doubt very much that the ANC will retain the majority. It may have the majority of votes cast, but not enough to pass the 50% threshold. That is both good and bad, in the sense that in a democracy, you'd rather have a seamless decision-making process, which, by the way, as we have seen living in the major metros, that it's what you don't get with coalitions. But sometimes when you have an entrenched culture of siphoning resources out of the system, that in fact may be the necessary pathway we have to cross in order to get to a more accountable political system. I do still feel, as per the last presentation, that the opposition is in limbo and it finds its voice. Initially, it was in limbo. It found its voice in the media and the courts. in terms of COVID-19. I doubt, when I say in limbo, I'm perhaps not fair to them. For the first time, I think South African opposition parties were genuinely giving the state the right and the latitude for them to take decisions and follow through on them. And I think I appreciated that. And I knew that at some stage, notwithstanding the criticism they were getting from other circles, that it was the right approach and demeanor. And in the right time, they are going to find opportunities to raise their voices. And indeed, they did. And it helps in South Africa that the courts, which is the third arm of government, provide a platform for resolution of disputes. And kudos to our courts, they have retained their integrity and have been able to arbitrate political disputes in a fair manner, in ways that at times us as the citizenry are supportive of, and in fact, in most cases. And so they have entrenched themselves as the platforms on which we can challenge state decisions and have the recourse that we want. I'll run quickly through the changes in the party system. I've already mentioned the ANC and the challenges it's going to face. The midterm trend, I believe, remains unchanged. First of all, we look at political parties because they are very important in the sense that it is political parties that aggregate voter preferences. In a democracy, you've got a huge range of interests in a country. Political parties help us because they aggregate those ranges of preferences in a manageable number of 400 people in one house in the National Assembly. And so at any given stage, what you have in the National Assembly is the aggregated preference of South Africans in terms of what they want with respect to their future. What we have seen, though, is that an increasing number of South Africans are catching up with their UK and the US counterpart in the wrong way by not wanting to participate in the political process. Why? Because many don't see that the political parties represent them. So that trend actually has been there ever since 1999, even though the ANC and the DA kept growing from 1999. Party support was declining even as the share of these two parties was gaining momentum. So what I mean by that is that people who were identifying with political parties, people were identifying less and less with the ideological preferences of political parties. And so we're not turning up to vote. We may have a bad situation like it happens in the UK, in the US, where a population which is less than half of the population actually votes and determines who gets to govern. And that shows something about the displeasure that people have about the political process. Why those huge numbers of people cannot mobilize to form a political vehicle which best captures their interests remains a question which is important for the US as well as ours. So the key I want to say here, as highlight here, without addressing the theoretical questions, is that political parties attempt to appeal to the median voter. And race has been a major determinant of party choice and party offering, because what we have seen is that people, for example, would want to have a political party which represented their own interest as far as race is concerned. But what we are seeing as an emerging trend, especially in the urban voter behavior, is that the median voter is increasingly focused on regime performance rather than issues of race, which remain, by the way, and then they're going to remain with us. So I'm arguing that this explains why the African National Congress is declining. It's because people are experiencing in real terms the decline which has been witnessed since the late 2000s. Because the ANC was increasing in popularity as in terms of voter choices, because it was delivering on crucial infrastructure, which the majority of the population was excluded from. But as South Africans began to have more aspirations, such as a better managed economy rather than only giving houses and more prospects for employment, they are increasingly focusing on voter performance. So the growth of the EFF also comes from people who are, displeased with the ANC, but are not trusting the Democratic Alliance enough to vote for them. What happens to the Democratic Alliance? When we saw the outcome, I was hoping that of the 2019 general election, I was hoping that your members remembered what we had spoken about at the conference, because what we've seen is that the Democratic Alliance, I gave them two pathways. One was one in which the new progressive forces within it consolidated their power, and despite a potential loss of support, which I had predicted, would attempt to strengthen that pathway with a view to getting longer-term gains. I also said there is a permissive environment for a splinter. I guess let me move to this next slide. I argued that there's a permissive environment for a splinter. I didn't want to update this photo, which I have here, which was on the slides last year, because I predicted that we were going to see a tension only at the next Congress of the DA, where John Steenhuisen would raise up his hand and want to challenge the position of party leader. Obviously, that ended up happening without a conference, and he's the interim party leader. So what's happened is that there's been a somewhat of a splinter, even though it's not the typical. I mean, the EFF splitted from the ANC this way, where influential leaders within the party broke ranks or were fired, and then they started a political party, which then ended up getting some of the support base of the ANC. My argument here is that the tensions in the DA, while they have been dealt with by an attempt to reclaim what the party used to be known for, they are simmering until the conference of the party, which is still to come, where Steenhuisen is poised to become the leader. My argument here is that Steenhuisen is going to face a difficulty of the old guard in the party, in the sense that he, for me, appears as a political leader who's still persuaded by the politics of attempting to transform the party with an intention to attract a greater support base. But Helen Zille, who have attempted this and saw the party change its soul and the battles for its soul, I don't think they are keen for that pathway again. So you are going to see this tension where the younger leaders are wanting the path that transforms the party to achieve, to still attract Black support, wider Black support, while the leaders like Helen Zille, who still may want to do so, but not in ways that alienate a section of its voter base, are going to have a difficulty buying into that trajectory. So the tensions remain as far as I'm concerned. Let me quickly look at the other issues that I'd like to highlight in terms of, as I think of this, there could be a minute or two that's remaining now. So, 5, thank you. So my argument here is that we could see a big formation of a major party, which takes a little bit of the Democratic Alliance and the center of the ANC, and embraces centrist politics. And this party could challenge both the ANC, the Democratic, all of the big three: ANC, Democratic Alliance, and the EFF. And I'm saying the DA was on a trajectory which could see itself become this party, but the pushback from within the party that wanted to go a lot more right compared to those that wanted to take the risks will see them it will put a final nail on their growth trajectory to become a party which is genuinely perceived to be representing everyone. So my argument is that what we may have is a big splinter party of part of the ANC, the right faction of the ANC, and the left faction of the DA, strangely, and perhaps and this party may attract that voter base which has now given up on the political process. And I think that the process to allow voting to happen also by independents may cause the trajectory towards that formation of a party to become a greater reality. We will see. We'll watch and see. I for some reason, I thought that Herman Mashaba and Musi Maimane could do this, but I think that haste is compromising what they can do, because whoever is championing the path towards this third way political party that I'm talking about would have to be a leader that's humble enough to be able to pull in the best from a variety of circles, including from the business environment, by the way, and other socioeconomic sectors. The last thought process I wanted to give in this last 3 minutes, which I have, has to do with what can unlock growth in South Africa and around the world going forward. I have an argument I want to make that says economic inclusion is vital for growth. I'm going to say why I feel so. So if you look at capitalism in the past 500 years, we have reached a stage of growth where now, as the world, we are stuck. We are stuck in the sense that you look, there's a low demand for resources globally. Oil is under pressure in terms of the base economic inputs into other industries. Growth generally in the developed world has been limited, and that's why the 21st century is regarded as the century of Africa. So my argument here is that in order to unleash the next level of growth, we need epistemic humility. Humility enough to recognize that there's something which we do not know. And when I say we, I'm talking about us who have been cultured in the global capitalist knowledge systems. And I'm saying we need to tap into the unknown to self and unknown to others. So the Johari window principle. What we don't know, and what others don't know about us. And my argument here is that in order to do so, we need to be humble and look at cultures in different ways. If you look at what BKB did in the mohair industry, BKB started to boost supplies of mohair by going into rural areas. And in fact, this is a strategy they have retained for a very long time, into rural areas. And instead of looking for the big commercial farmer, what they did was to look for small independent community farmers who owned between 10 to 30 sheep, and make sure that they collect that. And they have done so in ways that boost the total supply of mohair in the country. So I drive, and my wife comes from a place called Bizana. And in Bizana, what I've seen is that the average yield and production per household in terms of maize is probably anything each household plants about a hectare or two. Now, when we count the stock of maize, we arrogantly count only the stock of maize produced by commercial farmers in South Africa. Do the people in Bizana get bothered? No, they produce that output, and it gets used in the local economy and gets exported through the informal economy. So if we were humble enough, my argument about epistemic humility, all that may be needed to augment the national stock of maize in the country is to build the right infrastructure and have the road freight industry prioritize those areas and say, I'm going to start a business that collects corn or maize from these areas. It is there. The fact that we arrogantly say in a given year, the economy has now produced so much stock of maize and it's limited. And the people are laughing at us in Bizana because they've got that stock of maize. But our arrogance, our epistemic arrogance in terms of what we consider to be sustainable scales is in fact our problem, not the problem of the economy. Because if we did the infrastructure, we would be able to tap into those supplies. So last point that I want to make. I don't see my presentation there now. Anyway, my last point relates to this top that I'm wearing. I hope you agree. It's nice, Gavin. So this top was done by I wanted to ask the question as to what is similar among these images that we see here. So there's an image from Black Panther, the movie. There are people from Black Panther with Sutu blankets, and this famous designer who has attracted the attention of global singer Beyonce. What's common about all of them is that they reflect epistemic humility and inclusiveness. Black Panther became a multi-billion-dollar movie, tapping into culture and alternative ways of thinking. So Sutu blankets became a phenomenon globally shortly during that time. Imagine the logistics that comes with, if there had been a follow-through from a brand South Africa point of view and entrepreneurs that said, here, let's leverage on this creative piece of work that's been done. You could revolutionize an entire value chain exporting those Sutu blankets. Laduma Ngokolo, who is an alumni from our own university, that manufactured his own jersey that he's wearing on the screen, as well as mine. This product is selling globally. And I mean, if I can mention the price of mine, I'm embarrassed to say it, this top that I'm wearing, it's selling at a premium. And this guy has decided, I'm going to express myself as a Xhosa person, and I am affirming a culture that has been neglected and is created an economy out of it. So my argument is that we can do it with corn, we can with maize, and we can do it with medicine. Umhlonyane right now was a phenomenon. So there's a lot that we can still do. Thank you. Thanks.
Wow. What did I say at the beginning of this webinar? You're going to learn a fantastic amount during this webinar, and especially with Ongama's presentation. Ongama, I mean, I've had a couple of people saying to me, man, this guy's fantastic. I mean, what you've said, just the basics, I think for everybody has definitely had me just sitting here hanging on every word you're saying in terms of what you're saying. And sometimes you're quite correct. It's that humility. It's actually going back to basics and just understanding, you know what an economy is. An economy is about individual people doing individual things that eventually become like droplets in rain, that become a stream, that become a brook, that become a river. And I'm not trying to say that's what you're saying, but that's what I understand it as being. And that picture you painted of the little millie farms or the corn farms, the goats, man, I could see that. I grew up in the Eastern Cape. So I could see that, exactly that. Thank you so much for that presentation, and really food for thought. And the things you said last year in Swaziland, we've come to see to pass. And my hands up for if you're looking for presidency, I'm there. I'll drive your car for you. Wow! Thank you so much for that presentation. We have one question, and if you look at the comments at the bottom, it's all wow. Even from our friend Jan, commonly known as Sandile, he's also said wow. You mentioned the accidental rise of a paternalistic dictatorship, the idea that crises justify authoritarianism. What other approach could government have taken? Wow, I suppose it's $1 million question. Over to you, sir.
Sure. So government could have declared a state of emergency. the state of emergency would allow them to still do the things which they did, which include infringing on rights, but without taking the right of parliament to veto that. So that could have been one of the approaches. One could argue that if they had done so, I mean, we like debate. We would have debated to no end, and government would not have taken action. But it was a different way, which was safer too, because we would perhaps they would still be doing some of the things now because we would feel that they have been debated enough and they are the best among the alternatives.
I think we're known for doing that. I think, we've always prided ourselves in robust debate, and sometimes we debate for just the cause of debating, and we actually don't get to where we need to go. I know in the transport industry, we've probably got the best legislation around in the world. We went and studied what everyone else in the world did. We put it through various public debates and debated. And at the end of the day, the wonderful framework we have just doesn't seem to actually be applied. And that's one of our strongest points is robust debate. Again, Ongama, if you see the comments that are there on the bottom right hand of your screen, thank you so much. I know the time and the preparation you put in. I know Kevin did as well. So Kevin, in no ways have I forgotten your presentation, but really today has given me a lot of food for thought. So thank you once again to both presenters for your time, being willing to speak to us. For me now, it's the pleasure to hand over to the lucky draw.